It'll be 13 years on the 26th of July. In those years we've had a continuous fight against the establishment to get cases into court and get decency from the system. Been through civil court, which again failed, as did the criminal trial, which took place in 1991. But I'd like to go prior to my brother. Around 80, he bought a property, didn't enjoy. He approached, also been the owner, 5,000 at that time, was 20. Mole, his name was, who eventually murdered my brother, was aware that he was one of two people who owned land in front of me by the. However, £5,000. He then, there was already from the public branch off at the top onto his land, and he offered Mr. Moore £5,000 cash plus a complete new drive if the would be available to £10,000 and £25,000. Tony was able price, so it was quite obvious purchase of an access rear of Tony's home, and he managed to obtain an access through this woodland to the rear of his home. In 1981, there became Mrs. Cook from Milton Keynes, and she had a firm of managers in called on a day-to-day basis. Again, retain this access, and Tony would clear any fallen trees that were across bridleways or footpaths that ran through the wood, and he would look after the boundaries of the wood and no tipping or anything else very well up until 1989, late 1989, when he became aware that the wood was, and another neighbour was about to purchase the wood for 150,000 over putting a septic tank covers, but money plus a 7% stake in Tony's house. So we had to go about this septic tank in a very different way, and we achieved. However, when Tony made inquiries, and that he was paying 150,000, and so because Tony had enjoyed this access over the years, and it was the only to ask the owner of a farm that Tony had rented since he was village if there was, first of all, any truth in the fact that Savage was buying the land. The woodland at the rear of Tony was friendly with Mr. Savage, the land which Tony rented, and he was proposing to put 500 or 600 houses on the land. Anyway, sorry, I get mixed. Getting a bit dry. Approached Mr. Rippon, the owner of the farm, to see if he would ask Mr. Savage that if Tony put it in, he would leave in as short a time as possible if in reach through the woodland. Mr. Rippon was very happy at this because Tony had been a tenant. Because he was a member of the National Farmers Union, he was in for a big payoff if the development was part of his enterprise. Mr. Rippon went. Tony got back a couple of weeks later, was, in Tony's words, leave him where he is, he's paying rent, and when we're ready we'll have him at both places, meaning his home and the farm, which meant that he'd lost his access. However, there was a glimmer of hope. A lifelong friend of Tony's owned his place and offered to go 50-50 on this woodland, and they, although they asked him, well, Mr. Savage's price was 150,000, they upped the price to 175,000 up each to purchase the woodland. But this meant that Tony had a £1,200 a month more. It gave him the access that that he required to his house. Without it, his house was worthless. And so when I met him and Alan Smith on Christmas Eve of 1989, owners of the wood, 75,000 obviously around his neck, he was very happy that he'd at last achieved the Savage could cut him. He was months and 2 days on the 20th. During that time, an evening when he was at the farm, arrived there, he was very suspicious of them, and they were wanting to speak to Tony. Said that he went to the evening and gave him work done at the farm, and he never received. Suspicious of these three men. There were several things that happened. As I thought at that mall, he felt that there was something going on around him, and I wrongly now suggested him to be all consumed by these these two neighbours. Woodland that Tony, October of 1980, the warden over the illegal fence had said at that time to the new owners that was he bought the wood, he had to sort out the problem of this boundary. So what he did, all the boundaries of the wood, is he looked after the wood for 8 years. He was a solicitor who said that he needed to go with a witness and ask on the true boundary line. He did this, and when they went to see Terence Moore, he used foul language. It might clearly speak about that. He's still alive today. They told Terence Moore if the fence wasn't put back to the right line within 14 days, then obviously they would. And this did in fact happen. But over the next few months, and what frustrated him was that Mr. Moore wouldn't allow him to cross his land with a vehicle. Whatever he offered, he always wanted more, and yet Moore was just prepared to take Tony's land, knowing full well that he had no claim whatsoever to it. Numerous solicitors' letters were written, and as I say, the legal fees around it were going up, and it was and so therefore, and eventually decided that he would take the illegal fence down and lay it along the true boundary line, which he did do on 2 occasions that I know of. And on the 3rd occasion, on the 20th of July, men in the wood on Tony's woodland had told his dad when he came in for his tea from work in the evening, and Tony was very upset that once again, because they were actually down to the trees. So he went to the farm. Lee told him the dogs, and if he heard any say that his neighbour was firing at his dad. Tony had on 2 occasions prior to his death rang the police on the advice of a Detective Constable Raymond Pitt, who one evening Tony was in the house and his dog started to bark and the security lights came on, so he walked up into the woodland at the rear of his home where his Land Rovers were parked and walked all around the Land Rovers. It was pitch black, he didn't see anything, and as he turned to walk away, this was actually in the garden of his home, he turned round and Terence Moore was behind him holding a 12-bore shotgun. Me, Terry, and he said that this was about 12 o'clock at night, so he was very worried about someone lurking about right at the rear of his home at 12 o'clock at night. Anyway, he turned and walked down the steep log steps back to his house, and I asked Moore might shoot him, and they worried. He contacted Detective Constable Pitt, explained to him what had happened was that you must make a call to either Stroud or Stonehouse police station, report the incident fully, and ask for your. Some months later, he was used to working 18 hours a day machinery, and then he would and to exercise 12 o'clock. He came just through the gate, shotgun. Tony Woodland started to ask, and as the shotgun rang out over his head, and of course this really frightened. Back to the kennels, went into. It was the day of the World Cup, and he'd watched the World Cup, walked down to his farm in the village, was walking back up the lane home, and Terence Moore came up the lane and drove at him. And to police. No, but you are. When he went to his house, he rang the police and requested that Moore be visited. He was drunk and in charge of a vehicle and actually forced him into the hedge. The police had told Tony at that point, is he in the habit of doing it? But he and requested that they visit him. However, they decided that they would wait for him on another evening and catch him on his way home. A friend of his in the village, the wood, till I'd looking for Tony. He'd been erected and taken Lee back home, moved the fence once again, and confronted by Terence Moore, Greg Moore, and who ambushed him and brutally murdered him. The evening of the 27th and subsequent interviews give variants, can give the bone and tissue. It didn't take place where either said. They obviously lay in wait for Tony, and as he got back to the gate where he was about to climb over to go to his Land Rover, sorry, it's got me now. Funny, isn't it? Sorry, Andy. Is that all right? He met them in the wood according to their, and this was taken from their taped in. He said was, he called out the name Simon, their ear Simon, or we've got them Simon, or words to that effect. He was obviously at that point worried for his safety. The name was, although he was, our dad had always positioned that we didn't want people about the situation. If you were in a safety, then you, that someone else was a woman. He guns. I'm going to hold him 22. This is only, I'm taking this from the statements. There's no other witnesses to the killing but them. But the strange part about it is that the father, he says that his son's pushed back and he staggers back and the gun goes off and Tony shot. Certainly couldn't have happened there because there was no blood bone. The shooting took place some 12 yards further on when Tony was, and so Greg Moore fired at Tony in defence of his father. Now all this is that Tony, as I was showing the photographs, was heavily bloodstained. There was no blood stain on Terence Moore, who Tony was supposed to. There was no finger were carried, and Tony had onto his gun with his gun, but there's Tony on either gun. And that is the point where the shooting takes place. All the evidence is in the lane where Tony's body was that was, but I believe it to be closer than that because there are no satellite pellets around the wounds, and so therefore you had a very close range shooting, both barrels being fired simultaneously. There is a great oddity about this where, according to Mrs. Molly Moore, watching the television when she leaves home, this is what she says, 6th of July, and under the suspicion of murdering Tony, they had driven father to a point where with guns to soldiers, and this, as I've said before, was an illegal fence running through Tony's woodland. If their objective was to observe who was only had to walk 2 routes, one and also another one through a woodland path that came the same way. But they elected to be driven 3/4 of a mile, therefore be between Tony when he made his way back to the Land Rover. Well, what I've never been able to understand to the police, anyone else, if you drove someone to a bank with a gun, you would be an accessory to what went on, but she was never caught with anything, although because when she makes her second statement, she then admits to driving the 2 assailants. I believe that Tony's exit from the wood in the other direction, which would have taken him back to his home, not in the direction of his Land Rover, we stronged that when Lee, who was exercising the dogs and had heard the gunfire, went to look for his dad, he saw this 3rd gunman and the direction of the shot in his footsteps, and then he must have made his way out through the top of the wood, because when Lee released the dogs, they didn't go to the point where Tony was lying, nor were mistaken. There was definitely a 3rd gunman there, although the judge in our latest both got it wrong, but according to him everybody's got it wrong. The only one that was right was the murderer. He was only 14 at that time. He couldn't get the dog through because they released the dog on the lead, and as I said, both dogs then took off out to the top of the wood, in the way that we believe the 3rd gunman made his exit. He made an apple tree situation in mowing grass. The grass at that time was about 3 foot high. He was crouched, voice as being brought forward because and a person that he knew was fired, and the gun being fired accidentally because he had the sensation of hot metal and a rush of, but for the grace of God he isn't with his father, probably to do with the failing light, because at this time it was going very dark, but and looking for his dad, and with the fear that he had in him, and then to be shot is one to undergo. But to be 14 years old and have that, he ran for the nation about 12 foot. Luckily he ran down the track, caught by a teacher who had gone to the scene after Terence Moore shooting, saying there had been called an ambulance. Ambulanceman and they were looking at Tony to see if there was any sign of life, ran them for their lives. Tony was left where he was for 3.5 hours, just without any attention. This is the way that Tony was left in the lane. He just led there, and if he wasn't already dead, no one went back to him whatsoever. He, as I said, Mr. Graham, when he caught Lee, asked him, it was Gray and someone trying to get him, they shot him. Mr. Graham took Lee to his home and they treated her, but the ambulance exited. It then became a police matter where there was a cordon around the scene. I was called, I'll let Marilyn speak, she can take over.
I had a phone call from Rob's mum. She was 80. She said that she just had a phone call from a lady in Middle Yard. Lee had been shot or not, hysterical state, being all her other relatives. So I told her to, and that I would me, which excuse me, actual village where his mum lived, and so she told him up to, and he tells me that that's where there was the police had cordoned off the area by that time. When
I was at the friends, we'd gone there to play snooker, but it was such a lovely evening that we just sat outside and asked if I was one Marilyn, and she said that my mother said that Lee had been shot and he didn't know whether or not his dad had been shot. And I came out and straight away said Malls. I heard Malls because Tony had Mall Senior on the heads of Mrs. Daphne Tanner and her son who lived in the village. And Mrs. Tanner, she gave evidence at the civil trial in October last and was very emotional. She said she thought the judge didn't even tie the shooting of Tony up with that. He just said that was an intimidatory move, and also said that Maul had purchased the gun on the day of Tony's killing to take to the wood that evening just to intimidate Tony Allis, whoever else might have been there. Well, we thought that we know the law says that you can intimidate people with guns, but to go onto someone else's land and intimidate, and as they did later, shoot it, well, Morbick is a disgusting man. We put so many decent people on the stand who gave evidence around the boundary lines of the wood, we put a timber area of land that was owned by Tony, and yet Moore said that he'd owned it from 1972, when in fact this timber fella had actually felled. If I go there, Morbick and his sickening comments about taking guns to intimidate, at the first trial in 1991, the then judge, Justice Sheen, weren't allowed a jury, and at the end of the prosecution evidence, by the way, the Crown Prosecution Service used defence witnesses to place the prosecution because they had such a clear-cut case of murder. That's what we were told. It was certainly strong enough, the evidence before the court, to go into the defence, the jury, to decide whether Justice Sheen prosecution had failed to prove an agreement to kill. And so therefore he was effectively, as he said, ending the trial, to find both defendants had no say. This film is aware that anyone that's ever called for jury service can always challenge the fact that a judge can be challenged. If you as a juror say you want that trial on with you, but no juror factor. However, after dismissing the murder charges, he then asked the Crown Prosecution Service to consider whether it was in the public interest just to pursue the shooting of a 14-year-old boy by a gun at his father. From the forensic evidence that our ballistics expert has put up, from test firings, instruction that I took scene, 12 double-barrelled gun are fired simultaneously. However, this was the case. Everybody heard this one loud bang. The undertaker that dealt with Tony's arms were in the pugilates, and our ballistics expert, as soon as he became involved in the deep cut investigation, said straight away that he said, your brother wasn't murdered, he was brutally murdered. He was shielding his face with his arms when they shot him. But that not being enough, both cartridge cases were ejected, 2 more cartridges inserted. A gun is then there were other people in the vicinity, 2 ambulancesmen, Terence Moore and Mr. Graham, the school attendant, discharged. It just happened to be my nephew Lee, whose name had been the White Building. But I understand, when the judge asked the Crown Prosecution Service whether to consider whether it was in the public interest to pursue the shooting of a 14-year-old boy, to our amazement, they decided that it was an old boy and it wasn't in the public interest. The judge then, in all his wisdom, said that this just carrying unlicensed firearms. He said he had it in mind. So both the Moore on their car, the only thing that he did do was make sure that the guns should be destroyed. However, these guns still assured at this time by Gloucester Constabulary that the guns are still there if I need to run them. The shooting of Tony, the tests that I carried out with a friend at a target at given distances, we could only achieve a 4-inch separation of shots into 4 inches apart. For Tony to be shot in the way that he was, both shots went through the same line, and you can see on that photograph shows the line of shot that where Tony's arm was held up and his shield in his face. There's no way that Tony's arm was down. Dr. Stephen Nicklin, who incidentally at the walls, but at this late, the shots were on, Tony's arm had been by his side, and the shot that came in the way that the suggests, a way that he could turn almost 90 degrees to get these 2 varying angles when the blast that gave evidence to send, I can assure any that left in my life, I can fire a 12-bore shotgun, both barrels fired simultaneously, shots at a distance of 9 feet, and get the shots 12 inches up, as it's impossible. And yet we've been forced to have to accept that Tony can show the camera here, thus struggling with Terence Moore by that blast. We know the reason, because he wasn't struggling with anyone. But then to get the second wound into his shoulder, he had to turn to that angle so that the shot travelling between one that's ever seen it, that if people could move at the sort of speed my brother's supposed to move, we'd have some wonderful possibility. And I'm totally amazed that a man who calls himself a forensic and try and say that, and I could prove him wrong, and so could anybody else that knew anything at all. He's wrong. This trial, it's the latest trial has been a trial where we put up there, gave evidence as to the boundary line of the wood, and yet the judge somehow thought they didn't even give evidence 3 days into the trial, so therefore avoids giving evidence. Is people, the likes of a public school headmaster, he was headmaster of the public school, they were all very quick to grind. They went to court and gave evidence in truth and were really ridiculed by the old court system. It's a shameful exercise. Having seen it happen once, where we didn't have the evidence, all we done was sat through and listened to a case that the Crown Prosecution Service presented. We felt there was enough evidence for the trial to run through its duration. In this trial, we produced overwhelming evidence, and as one local journalist said to me, he said the judge didn't find in your favour on any one point. Are they all Masons, Bob? This is the belief that a pathology report being struck through when in fact he was 5'11". His height was altered in court. They tried to make him 18 or 20 stone in weight to go along when in fact he was about 14 stone. And I actually produced his passport, and I'm 6'3", and I made him look quite short. It was quite clear, and also quite clearly his height was. But as a background, whereas on we could go to court and show all these things, and then this Masonic element, if it's something, it's got to be. So many people couldn't get so many things wrong without anybody querying it. There's just so many things wrong. Everybody's appalled. And when we got to the stage in this latest trial, Greg Moore picked the gun up. Somehow it managed to go off accidentally. We then had, up to that time, Marilyn and I had acted as solicitors through, but we were given legal aid back with a few days before the trial. And so any more of this, he stood up, we walked out, and as we passed the public gallery emptied, and so did all the journalists. And the journalist in there said that they could have court, yet the judge didn't find it was a mock. I've lost in the region of £250,000 to date over 12 years. Seat in the murdered. I want to, if they're on the moon, they need to know he was brutally murdered, and the system in this country has allowed this to be covered up. There are many things wrong with the police investigation. It was it was ridiculed throughout in the latest trial with the way that the police went about their investigations. But they saw, and I can't either done purposely or mistakenly. We don't know. But the further down the line we go, the worst street on 2 occasions. We've been to the Home Office, just about everywhere. Everybody's full of sympathy for us. Well, we don't inquiry into this that have had up and swept under the carpet. Well, it's time all this finished, and if it's got to start with Tony's case, then let's start there. But I'm saying that we need an inquiry into this total corrupt cover-up that we've had to follow over the last 12 years. It's bad enough to lose and died of an illness. And, oh, well, we're sorry, even if the court did get it wrong, there's nothing more that can be done. Perpetrators of crime, we could go to the High Court time and time again and appeal. And oh no, we need to challenge. It's high time to get a little bit equal up. Let's this scales of justice. Let's see it hanging as a scales of justice, not a weighted system in favour of the perpetrators of crime, because I'm afraid that's what we face in favour of the criminal. Trial, Mr. Parroy QC, who, as our barrister described him, a loathsome in the robing room, that he defended these. He got him off murder 11 years ago, and he was back to get him off this civil trial. He said that the council, people who overheard Parroy saying that, boasting about getting murderers off the hook. Well, we thought that the courts in this country, okay, everybody's entitled to a defence, but when it comes to that the rules are bent and everything's perverted in the plays no part, then I think we've really got a need to all be worrying, because it's happening over and over again now. There are many distressed people across the country. We know, when I was a murderer in this area, and then that was a big journalist. At the time of the last trial, when I did a recording for there was 12 unsolved. Ended for, well, it's signed, as I said, with Justice for a victim to the service in a trial which you didn't have at the court late, and the court was full up, then you didn't have a right to a seat in there. That's been changed since we've campaigned. And also this function of the coroner and all the other officials around a murder inquiry, so therefore people know what to expect. Police forces across the country are supposedly, well, most of the murder victims, the murderers, that's just come to mind. That's always been a great oddity. My brother's body was July 1990. He was removed from the scene 4.5 hours after the shooting. He was taken to Gloucester Royal. Normally, in the circumstance that my brother died in or dies suddenly, an inquest is ordered, and the inquest opens and adjourns within days. It didn't open until the 29th of November, so that's 4 months on from the time of the shooting. I contacted Inquest in London to ask if they had a list of anything that they'd ever seen where the authorities were in possession of a body. You always open and adjourn, and then in our case we didn't have an inquest. The coroner told me when I called for a meeting with him, he couldn't, although he had great sympathy for us, he couldn't bring in a verdict that conflicted. It was surely if the evidence on the table or what the correct or and then it's unlawful killings. Did you want to say something?
Well, I was going to say that what we've forgotten to say is that in to the county court, absence, Terence, and also ordered to pay £500 for the damage done, and an injunction against him to stop him from going back on the land. And in 1993, the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board ruled that Tony had died and contributed to the injury, his family £148,038. Now that is in quite
Stark contrast.
yes, it is stark contrast to what two judges have said. Now we're very proud of his actions on that night, and he hoped that Mr. Moore's health would soon recover. And the second judge, the taking of and saying there's pocketfuls of cards, beggars belief, when there is such a cry really about disliking weapons. They're just what else. Or it can.
Well, that's right. All taken. Not see as if we always had the greater than we always had a higher than 50% chance of success, and yet in this latest trial, as in the first, we didn't win any 1 point. We just all these people, including this panel of lawyers, who sanctioned the paying of quite a large sum of public money. This is all 150,000. The murderer has to pay us to court at cost there, and then to see people on the stand lying. We saw Greg Moore telling packs of lies, and when he's under cross-examination, and the same applied to Stephen Nicklin, the defence ballistic judge, in all his wisdom, seemed to turn a blind eye to that. Well, we thought that they were there to give evidence, not the QC was mouthing the words that they should use. But how did the people that are at awards verdict so different to their eldest daughter Morbick? He didn't have the conviction or the courage to go against his colleague. I think he's going to probably lose his chance, but I mean that's not the point of courts of law, as we thought. The judge that was handling this latest case, Justice Owen, and actually into life, was very interested in Moore's antics, previous antics with guns, and his purchase of a gun on the day we went to pre-trial hearings with him. However, because of the messing about by the legal aid, that judge point of view, that was no coincidence that we lost that judge. The judge was a judge, a very straight man, which is very much more than we can say about Morbick, who was a flanneler and was all very nice to the witnesses and stabbed them in the back after they'd gone home.